The underworld was always there. Not created as punishment, not built by gods who judged the living. It simply was. Beneath the mountains, beneath the earth, beneath the temples and the rivers and the cities of clay, there waited a place older than memory. A place where all things ended and where nothing returned. You don't need to learn its laws tonight. You don't need to remember the names carved into its gates. This is only a slow walk through ancient dust, through quiet halls, through stories told so long ago that even their tellers have descended into that same stillness. There are no sudden sounds here, no urgency, only the gentle unfolding of what the Sumerians believed lay waiting in the dark beneath the world. Let the words wash over you. Let them settle like silt. You can drift whenever you need to. Welcome to Vault of Antiquity Lore. In the beginning, or what passed for beginning in the minds of those who built the first cities between two rivers, the cosmos was not a mystery to be solved, but a structure to be lived within. There was heaven, bright and distant, where the great god held his court among stars that never dimmed. There was earth, where barley grew in careful rows, where the Euphrates and Tigris carried silt and life from the mountains to the sea, where kings ruled from ziggurats of sun-baked brick, where children were born and grew old and were laid to rest in the ground. And there was the place below. The Sumerians called it Kur. The word itself carried weight, like stone sinking through water. It meant mountain. It meant foreign land, the distant places beyond the known world where strange peoples lived and strange languages were spoken. And it meant the place beneath, the realm of no return, the house of dust, the land where all roads ended. Kur was not hell. This is important to understand, though it takes time to feel the difference. It was not a place of flames or torment, not a realm designed by wrathful deities to punish the wicked and reward the virtuous. It was simply the destination, inevitable as sunset, as certain as the seasons turning, as final as the last breath leaving the body. The Sumerians did not imagine an afterlife of judgment, of scales weighing the heart, of paradise for the good and suffering for the evil. They imagined a place of stillness, a place where motion stopped, where light dimmed to almost nothing, where all people, regardless of how they had lived, went down into the same darkness. The world above was full of light and motion. The world below was still. In the cosmology that shaped their temples and their prayers, the universe rested on ancient pillars, invisible but unshakable. Ankai, they called it. Heaven and earths. The bright above and the fertile below, separated by Lil, the wind, the breath, The Chinese letter SPCE, where birds flew and storms gathered, and clouds drifted across the face of the sun. But beneath the earth, beneath the foundations of the mountains and the deepest wells that men could dig, beneath the roots of the oldest trees and the buried ruins of cities lost to time, there stretched another realm entirely. Some said it lay beneath the sweet waters of the Apsu, the primordial deep from which all life had risen in the first days of creation. Some said it was guarded by rivers no living person could cross, dark waters that flowed in the wrong direction, away from the sea, down into depths that had no bottom. Some said it was simply down, endlessly down, past root and rock and the memory of sunlight, a journey that took days even for the dead, who no longer tired. And in that downward place there were gates. The gates were not merely doors. They were not simple barriers of wood and bronze that could be unlatched and opened. They were thresholds of transformation, boundaries that demanded price. To pass from the world of breath into the world of stillness required more than journey. It required surrender. It required the stripping away of everything that had made you who you were in the world above. The myths speak of 7 gates, though the number itself holds the weight of ritual, of completion, of sacred stages that cannot be skipped or hurried. 7 like the days of the week, like the visible planets that wandered against the fixed stars, like the levels of the great ziggurats that rose toward heaven. Each gate was watched. Each gate had a gatekeeper who knew the law, who had stood at that threshold since the beginning of time, who would stand there until time itself ended. And the law was simple, ancient, unbreakable. You could descend, but you could not return unchanged. You could not return without offering something in your place. The dead who arrived at those gates came as shadows of what they had been. They had left behind their bodies, their flesh returned to the earth, their bones wrapped in linen or laid bare in the grave. They had left behind their names as spoken in the world above, their titles and honors, their wealth and their poverty, their beauty and their strength. What remained was a dim reflection, a pale copy, something the Sumerians called Gidim. A ghost, a shade, a whisper of the person who had been. These spirits did not burn in flames. They did not suffer tortures devised by demons with creative cruelty. They simply existed in a state of lessness. Less light, less sound, less sensation, less life. They wore feathers like birds, the ancient texts say, or garments made of dust that shifted and fell and reformed with each slow movement. They ate clay, bitter and dry on tongues that could no longer taste. They drank water that brought no refreshment, that satisfied no thirst. They sat in the dim halls and the silence, and they did not leave. You don't need to picture it clearly. Let the images blur. Let them soften into the dark behind your eyes. The ruler of this realm was not a god of punishment, but a goddess of inevitability. Her name was Ereshkigal, and the name meant Queen of the Great Below, Queen of the land from which there is no return, Lady of the vast earth. In the oldest stories, she did not choose her throne. She was given it or taken to it, separated from the world above by fate or by the will of powers older and stranger than the gods themselves. Some myths suggest she was carried off to the underworld in the earliest days of creation, before the cosmos had fully settled into its order, before heaven and earth had been completely separated, before the first humans had been shaped from clay. The god Kur, personified as a monstrous serpent or dragon in some tellings, abducted her and carried her down into the depths. Or perhaps Kur was not a being, but simply the place itself, and Ereshkigal descended of necessity, because someone had to rule the dead, someone had to maintain the boundary, someone had to sit on the throne in the darkness and ensure that the law was kept. Others simply place her there, enthroned, eternal, alone. As if she had always been there. As if the underworld and its queen had come into being together, inseparable, 2 aspects of the same deep truth. She did not descend from her palace, to visit the world above. She did not walk among the living, did not attend the festivals in the great cities, did not receive offerings in temples bright with oil lamps and sweet with incense. She ruled the dead from a palace of shadow and dust, and her word was law. Not the law of kings, which could be bent by influence or broken by rebellion. Not the law of men, which changed with each generation, but the law of nature itself. The law that said all living things must die. The law that said the dead do not return. Ereshkigal was not cruel in the way later underworld deities would be imagined. She did not devise torments for pleasure. She did not laugh at the suffering of souls. She was stern. She was absolute. She was, in her own way, just. She did not forgive trespass, but neither did she invent suffering for its own sake. She maintained the boundary between life and death, and that boundary was sacred. To enter her realm uninvited was to break the oldest law. To leave her realm without her consent was impossible, a thing that went against the very structure of the cosmos. Even the gods feared her, not because she wielded chaos or destruction, but because she wielded stillness. She was the end of all motion, the silence after the last word, the darkness after the last star went out. Her consort in some tellings was Nergal, a god of plague and war and the scorching heat of summer, who had descended into her realm through arrogance or fate, and through conflict or seduction or both, claimed a place beside her throne. But Ereshkigal's power predated him. Her loneliness, her isolation in the depths, was older than his arrival. She sat in her palace, and she judged no one, because judgment was not the function of Kur. The dead came. The dead stayed. That was the order of things. That was the way the world worked. That was the truth that could not be changed by prayer or sacrifice or the intercession of the mightiest gods. And the living, for their part, understood this. They knew that death was not punishment. It was transition. It was the natural end of the journey that began at birth. But they also knew that the dead required care. Without proper burial, without offerings, without the rituals that bound the living to the memory of those who had gone below, a spirit could become restless. A Giddim without descendants to speak its name, without libations poured into the earth, without bread left at the grave, might wander, might grow hungry for what it had lost, might scratch at the boundary between worlds, seeking the warmth of the living, the taste of food that was not clay, the sound of voices that were not whispers. The Sumerians buried their dead with great care. They placed the body in the earth, returned it to the clay from which, according to their myths, the gods had shaped the first humans. They positioned the body carefully, often on its side, knees drawn up as if sleeping, hands folded or placed near the face. They left vessels of water beside the body, bowls of grain, dates and bread, beer in ceramic jars sealed with clay stoppers. They placed tools and ornaments in the grave, things that might ease the journey to the underworld or provide comfort to the shade in its new existence. A potter might be buried with his tools, a woman with her jewelry, a child with a toy. They poured offerings into the ground, libations of water and beer and oil that seeped down through soil and stone to reach the ones below. They spoke the names of ancestors. They remembered, because to be forgotten was a second death, deeper, and more final than the first. And sometimes, in the deep hours of night, the dead returned in dreams. Dreams were a threshold space, neither fully the world of the living nor fully the realm of the dead. In sleep, the boundary grew thin. The living soul, temporarily loosened from the body, could wander near the edges of Kur. And sometimes the dead, sensing this nearness, would come to meet them. A father might appear in the dream, standing in shadow, his face difficult to see, asking in a voice like wind through reeds for water to be poured at his grave. A child might be glimpsed in the distance, waiting at the edge of vision, neither approaching nor leaving. A wife long dead might stand at the threshold of the dreamer's house, silent, her eyes holding questions that could not be spoken. These visitations were not hauntings in the sense of terror or malice. They were reminders. The dead still existed, somewhere in the dim halls below the world. They still needed the living to remember them, to feed them, in a sense, with prayer and offering, and the simple act of speaking their names aloud into the air. You can let your mind wander now. You don't need to hold onto every detail. The names will be here if you return to them. The underworld had its own geography, though it was not mapped the way the cities above were mapped, with careful measurements and boundary stones and records kept on clay tablets. There were rivers, or so the myth suggested, though their names varied from telling to telling. Dark waters that had to be crossed, perhaps in a boat, perhaps by wading through cold current that pulled at the legs of the newly dead. The river Huber is mentioned in some texts, a boundary water that encircled the land of the dead, separating it from the world of the living as surely as ocean separated one land from another. There were fields, barren and grey, where nothing grew, where no rain fell, where no wind stirred the dust. There were halls, vast and echoing, where the shades gathered in silence, sitting or standing or simply existing in the dimness, their purposes, if they had purposes, unknowable. There were chambers deep within the underworld, far from the gates, where Ereshkigal held court, where her ministers and demons attended her will, where the great decisions were made that governed the realm of the dead. The gatekeeper of the outermost gate was named Neti, chief gatekeeper, guardian of the threshold. He had stood at that gate since the underworld came into being, and he would stand there until the cosmos itself unraveled. He questioned all who came. He demanded to know why the living sought entrance, if entrance was sought by the living. He enforced the stripping away, the removal of garments and ornaments and power, gate by gate, until the one who descended arrived naked and humble before the throne of Ereshkigal. This was not cruelty. It was not personal. It was law. To enter the realm of the dead, one had to become like the dead. To shed the trappings of life. To leave behind crown and jewel and scepter. To leave behind the pride of the upper world. To arrive in the depths as powerless as any shade. And so we come to the story that defines the Sumerian underworld more than any other. The story that reveals its nature, its laws, its terrible fairness. The descent of Inanna, Queen of Heaven, into the realm of her dark sister. It is a myth of transformation, of sacrifice, of boundaries crossed and prices paid. It is also, in its slow unfolding, a story made for quiet telling. For the long hours of night. For the kind of listening that does not require answers, only the rhythm of words in the darkness. Inanna was goddess of love and war, of fertility and destruction, of the morning and evening star that appeared at dawn and dusk, brightest of all the lights in the sky save sun and moon. She ruled in the world above. She wore the crown of heaven. She held the sacred powers that governed civilization, that made possible cities and laws and writing and all the arts by which humans lived. She was radiant. She was proud. She was beloved and feared in equal measure. And one day, for reasons the myths do not fully explain, she turned her gaze downward. She set her mind toward the great below, toward the realm of her sister, Ereshkigal. Some say she went to attend a funeral, the rites for Inanna, the bull of heaven, who had been the husband of Ereshkigal before his death. Some say she went out of ambition, seeking to extend her dominion even into the land of the dead, to rule both the world of light and the world of darkness. Some say she went because the underworld called to her, because even the brightest goddess must know the dark, must descend into the depths to understand the full circle of existence. Some say she went seeking knowledge or power, or simply because it was her fate written in the stars before she was born. Whatever her reason, she prepared herself for the journey. She dressed in her finest garments, robes of linen and wool dyed in precious colors. She adorned herself with the 7 me of power, the sacred objects that marked her divinity and her authority. The shugara, the crown of the steppe. Beads of lapis lazuli at her throat. Twin beads across her breast. The parlor dress, the garment of ladyship. Kohl around her eyes. The measuring rod and line in her hand, symbols of justice and judgment. Each one a piece of her power. Each one precious beyond measure. She instructed her minister, Ninshubur, loyal servant and friend, to wait 3 days. If Inanna did not return in 3 days, Ninshubur was to raise the alarm, to go to the great gods and plead for Inanna's rescue, to ensure that the Queen of Heaven was not lost forever in the depths. Then Inanna descended. The journey from the bright temples of Uruk down into the underworld was long. How long, the myths do not say. Days, perhaps, or the timeless passage that belongs to sacred journeys, where distance is measured not in steps, but in transformation. Inanna walked the road that the dead walked. She passed through landscapes that grew dimmer and more barren with each step. She came at last to the first gate of Kur, a great door of some dark material, bronze perhaps, or stone, or something else entirely, something that existed only in the underworld. She knocked. She demanded entry. Neti, the chief gatekeeper, heard the knocking. He came to the gate and called through it, asking who dared to disturb the silence of the land of no return. Inanna announced herself. I am Inanna, Queen of Heaven. Open the gate. Neti did not open the gate. Instead, he went to inform his queen, Ereshkigal. Ereshkigal, sitting on her throne in the depths, received the news. Her sister, bright Inanna, Queen of Heaven, sought entrance to the underworld. The myths say Ereshkigal slapped her thigh in anger, or perhaps in dark amusement. She bit her lip. She was not pleased. She did not welcome this intrusion. But she could not simply refuse. The gates of the underworld opened for the dead, and though Inanna was not dead, she had come of her own will. Ereshkigal gave her instructions to Neti. Let her enter, but treat her according to the ancient rites. Let her pass through the 7 gates of the underworld, and at each gate remove something from her. Strip her of her power. Bring her before me as the dead are brought. Naked, powerless, humbled. And so it began. Neti returned to the first gate. He opened it just enough for Inanna to pass. And as she stepped through, he reached out and took the crown from her head, the shugara, the symbol of her queenship. Inanna stopped. She protested. "What is this? Why do you take my crown?" Neti answered in words that echo through all the myths of the underworld. "Be silent, Inanna. The ways of the underworld are perfect. They may not be questioned. The ways of the underworld are perfect. Not good, not kind, but perfect, complete, unchangeable. The law that cannot be bent." Inanna, crownless, continued on. She walked the dim paths between the first gate and the second. The underworld was growing darker now. Colder. The air, if it was air, pressed close. She came to the second gate. It opened. Neti took the beads from her throat, the lapis lazuli that marked her as divine. Again she protested. Again he gave the same answer. "Be silent. The ways of the underworld are perfect." At the third gate, he took the twin beads from her breast. At the fourth gate, her parlor dress, the garment of ladyship. She stood now in her undergarments, her power visibly diminishing with each gate she passed. At the fifth gate, Neti took the kohl from around her eyes, the cosmetic that enhanced her beauty, the mark of her radiance. At the sixth gate, he took the measuring rod and line from her hand, the symbols of justice and order, the tools by which she ruled. And at the seventh and final gate, he took her remaining garment, the last cloth that covered her body. She entered the throne room of Ereshkigal naked, powerless, stripped of every symbol that had made her queen of heaven. In appearance, she might have been any mortal woman, any shade arriving in the land of the dead, though divinity still burned faintly within her, a spark that could not be entirely extinguished. Ereshkigal sat upon her throne and watched her sister approach. The myths do not record what was said between them, if anything was said at all. Perhaps there were no words. Perhaps only the long look between sisters who ruled opposite realms, who embodied opposite principles. Light and darkness, life and death, motion and stillness. Perhaps Ereshkigal felt rage at this intrusion. Perhaps she felt vindication that the Bright One had finally come down to understand the darkness. Perhaps she felt nothing at all, only the cold execution of the law. The Inanna were there. The 7 judges of the underworld, ancient gods or demons, or simply the personification of the underworld's law. They sat in the shadows of Ereshkigal's throne room. They fixed their gaze upon Inanna. They did not speak, but their judgment was clear. And Inanna was struck down. The myths say that Ereshkigal fastened upon her the eye of death, that she spoke the word against her, that she uttered the cry of guilt. Inanna died. Her corpse was hung on a hook, a piece of rotting meat, an object lesson, left to decay in the depths where nothing decayed because nothing lived. 3 days passed in the world above. The sun rose and set, rose and set, rose and set. Ninshuba waited at her post, watching for her queen's return. When Inanna did not emerge from the underworld after the third day, Ninshuba knew something terrible had happened. She tore at her garments in grief. She beat the drum of mourning. She went to the temples of the great gods and began to plead. First she went to Enlil, father of the gods, lord of the wind, king of heaven and earth. She prostrated herself before him. Great Enlil, Inanna has descended to the underworld and has not returned. Please go to her aid. Rescue her from the land of the dead. Enlil refused. He was cold in his refusal. Inanna sought the underworld of her own will. She opened the gates herself. She descended knowing the law. Let her face the consequences of her actions. The underworld is not a place from which gods can simply pluck back what has been taken. Ninshuba left Enlil's temple without aid. Next she went to Nanna, the moon god, Inanna's own father. Surely a father would rescue his daughter from death. She made the same plea. Nanna, your daughter Inanna, is trapped in the underworld. Go to her. Save her. But Nanna too refused with the same reasoning. Inanna descended of her own choice. The laws of the underworld are ancient and binding. He would not intervene. Ninshuba left, her grief deepening. Finally she came to Enki, god of wisdom, of fresh water, of cleverness and craft. Enki ruled from the Apsu, the sweet waters beneath the earth, and he knew secrets that other gods did not. Enki, unlike the others, was moved by Ninshuba's plea. He understood the laws of the underworld, but he also understood that laws could be worked with, that there were ways to navigate even the strictest boundaries if one was clever enough. He set his mind to the problem. Enki could not go to the underworld himself. That would be a violation, an invasion, an act that might tear the cosmos apart. But he could send emissaries. He reached under his fingernails where dirt had gathered, and from that dirt he fashioned two beings. They had no gender, or both genders, or something else entirely. They were neither fully alive nor fully dead. They were creatures of the in-between, the threshold. He named them, though their names vary in different versions of the myths. The Kurguru and the Galatu, perhaps. He gave them careful instructions. Descend to the underworld. Do not eat the food of the dead. Do not drink the water of the dead. Those who eat and drink in the underworld must stay in the underworld. Go to Ereshkigal. You will find her in pain, groaning, suffering. When she groans, groan with her. When she cries out, echo her cry. Mirror her suffering. Show her empathy, something she has not known in all her long isolation. And when she offers you a gift in gratitude, ask only for the corpse that hangs upon the hook. The two creatures descended. They passed through the 7 gates, unnoticed or perhaps allowed through because they were neither living nor dead. They came to the throne room. They found Ereshkigal not sitting in stern majesty, but writhing in pain. The myths say she suffered as a woman in childbirth, though what she labored to bring forth is not clear. Perhaps it was only the pain of her existence, the endless loneliness of her role, the isolation of ruling a realm that no one visits by choice. She groaned with the pain of her innards. She groaned with the pain of her heart. She moaned with the pain of her liver. And the Kurgara and the Galata moaned with her. They echoed every cry. They mirrored every groan. They shared her suffering without question, without judgment, without offering solutions or trying to take the pain away. They simply acknowledged it, witnessed it, and Ereshkigal, stunned by this unexpected compassion, felt something she had perhaps never felt before. Gratitude, connection, the sense of being seen in her pain. When her groaning subsided, she turned to the two creatures. "You have comforted me in my suffering. Ask for a gift, anything I can give, and it is yours." They asked, as Enki had instructed, for the corpse that hung on the hook. Ereshkigal agreed. She was bound by her word. She allowed them to take the body of Inanna. The Kurgara and the Galata took the corpse down from its hook. They sprinkled upon it the food of life and the water of life, substances that Enki had given them, drawn from the deepest sources of his power. And Inanna revived. She drew breath. Her eyes opened. Color returned to her skin. She stood alive again, a goddess restored. But the law remained. The oldest law. The law that even Enki's cleverness could not circumvent entirely. No one ascends from the underworld without leaving a substitute. Someone must take Inanna's place in the land of the dead. Demons rose from the shadows. The Gala, servants of the underworld, enforcers of its law. They surrounded Inanna. They could not be swayed by pleading or bribery. They could not be fought off with weapons or magic. They were the law made manifest. They would follow Inanna back to the world above, and they would not leave until a substitute had been found, until someone had descended to take her place on the hook. Inanna began the journey back up through the 7 gates. At each gate, her garments and symbols were returned to her. The robe, the measuring rod, the coal, the beads, the crown. By the time she emerged into the world above, she appeared once more as the Queen of Heaven, radiant and terrible. But the demons were with her, invisible to others perhaps, but present, waiting, watching. She returned to her city of Uruk. The first person she encountered was Ninshubur, her loyal minister, still dressed in mourning garments, still grieving for her lost queen. Inanna looked at Ninshubur. The demons waited for her word. But Inanna would not give Ninshubur to them. Ninshubur had mourned. Ninshubur had sought help. Ninshubur had been faithful. Inanna moved on. She found others in the city who had honored her absence with grief, who had torn their garments and wept, who had made offerings at her temples and prayed for her return. Each time, Inanna refused to give them to the demons. They had loved her properly. They had kept faith. But then she came to the broad apple tree, and she found Dumuzi. Dumuzi was Inanna's husband, or consort, or lover. A shepherd god, beautiful and beloved, associated with fertility and the spring. He should have been in mourning. He should have been dressed in rough cloth, his face smeared with ashes, leading the city in lamentation for his lost wife. But he was not. He sat upon Inanna's throne as if it were his own. He was dressed in magnificent robes. He was surrounded by servants and musicians. He was comfortable, happy, enjoying the power and privilege that Inanna's absence had granted him. He had not mourned. He had not wept. He had taken what was hers and made it his own. Inanna looked at him with the eye of death, the same eye that Ereshkigal had fastened upon her. She did not hesitate. She did not grieve. She spoke a single word to the demons. Him. The demons seized Dumuzi. He tried to run. He fled from the throne, from the city, out into the fields and marshes. He called upon the sun god Utu, who was his brother-in-law, Inanna's brother. Help me. Transform me so the demons cannot find me. Utu, perhaps out of pity, perhaps bound by family obligation, changed Dumuzi into a gazelle. Dumuzi fled as an animal, swift and terrified. But the demons were not fooled. They were not slowed. They pursued him across the land. Dumuzi ran to his sister, Inanna. Hide me, he begged. Protect me from the demons. Inanna, loyal and loving, hid her brother. She lied to the demons when they came asking. She sent them in the wrong direction. But demons cannot be fooled forever. They found him. Some versions of the myth say that a friend betrayed Dumuzi's location. Some say the demons simply searched until no hiding place remained. They found him in the sheepfold, or in the house of Inanna, or in some other place of refuge that proved to be no refuge at all. They seized him. They dragged him down into the underworld to take Inanna's place in the realm of death. And Dumuzi descended. The shepherd god went down into Kur. He passed through the 7 gates, each one stripping away his beauty, his youth, his vitality. He arrived in the depths naked and powerless, and he was placed where Inanna had been placed. In the house of dust. In the land of no return. The price was paid. The law was satisfied. But the story does not end there. It does not end in simple cruelty or revenge. Because Inanna, grieving for her brother, went searching for him. And when she learned what had happened, when she understood that Dumuzi was trapped in the underworld forever, she made an offer. Let me share his fate. Let me take his place for half the year, and let him take mine for the other half. Let us divide the burden between us. And somehow, whether by Ereshkigal's decision or by some deeper structural mercy in the cosmos itself, the offer was accepted. Dumuzi would spend half the year in the underworld, 6 months in the depths, in the darkness, in the house of dust. And then he would rise, would return to the world above for 6 months, while Inanna descended to take his place. And then they would trade again. Back and forth, up and down, each taking their turn in the land of the dead, each being released in their season. The Sumerians saw in this myth the cycle of the seasons, the death of vegetation in the scorching summer when the land turned brown and the plants withered, the return of green in the cooler months when rain came and barley sprouted and flowers bloomed. Dumuzi in the underworld was the land in drought. Dumuzi returned was the land restored. The myth explained the world they lived in, the endless cycle of death and rebirth that they witnessed every year. But it also explained something deeper. The law of the underworld, the boundary that must be maintained, the price that must be paid. You can rest now. Let the story settle. You don't need to remember every name, every detail. Just the feeling of it. The inevitability. The law. The myth of Inanna's descent reveals the core nature of Kur. It is not a place of moral judgment. Inanna is not punished for sin. She is subject to the law of the place itself, the ancient boundary that even gods must respect. The underworld is inevitable. It is the place where motion stops, where the bright things of the upper world are stripped away, gate by gate, symbol by symbol, until nothing remains but the essential self, naked and vulnerable. Where all things, God and mortal alike, become equal in their powerlessness. But the myth also shows that the underworld can be negotiated with. Enki's cleverness matters. His compassion toward Ereshkigal, expressed through his created beings, matters. The goddess of the underworld is not beyond feeling. She is isolated, lonely, suffering in ways that no one acknowledges. And when that suffering is witnessed, when someone groans with her in her pain, she responds with unexpected generosity. The law is upheld, but there is flexibility within it. A substitute can be found. A cycle can be established. Death does not have to be the absolute end, though it always remains the absolute boundary. The Sumerians understood this tension. They knew that death was certain, that everyone would eventually descend to Kur, that the underworld waited patiently for all. But they also knew that the living and the dead were not entirely separated, that there were ways to maintain connection, that offerings mattered, that memory mattered, that the proper performance of rituals could ease the journey of the dead and protect the living from the restless hunger of forgotten ghosts. This understanding shaped how they lived. They honored the dead with elaborate burials. They built tombs for kings and simple graves for commoners, but in both cases they took care. They positioned the body correctly. They left food and drink. They sealed the grave to protect it from disturbance. And then, for days and months and years afterward, they returned to that grave to make offerings. They poured water into the earth. They left bread and beer. They burned incense. They spoke the name of the dead person aloud, calling to them across the boundary, ensuring that they were not forgotten in the depths below. The fear of being forgotten was profound. A person with no descendants, no one to speak their name, no one to make offerings, was doomed to a worse existence in the underworld. They would wander the edges of the realm, eating garbage, drinking from stagnant ditches, begging for scraps. The hierarchy of the afterlife was not based on virtue or sin, but on memory, on whether the living still cared. A king with many descendants who honored his memory would rest comfortably in the underworld, attended and remembered. A beggar with no family would suffer a second abandonment in death. One ancient text describes this clearly. A man, through some magic or divine intervention, speaks with a spirit who has returned from the underworld. The living man asks questions. Tell me, how do the dead fare below? And the ghost answers, describing the different fates. The man with 7 sons is honored, seated near the gods. The man with 6 sons is comfortable. The man with 5 sons, with 4, with 3, each one less honored, but still cared for. The man with 2 sons, with 1 son, each receives some measure of attention, some offerings, some memory. But the man with no sons, the ghost says, eats the scrapings of the pot. He drinks what is left in the dregs. He wanders without rest, without comfort, forgotten by the world above. And the man who died in battle, he is honored. His father and mother cradle his head, and his wife weeps over him. The man who died by fire, by drowning, by accident or violence, each has their particular condition in the underworld, some better than others depending on the nature of their death and the rituals performed for them. But always, always, the determining factor is whether someone above still remembers, still cares, still pours the water and speaks the name. This is not justice as we might understand it. It is not fairness. It rewards those who happen to have family, who happen to be remembered. But it reflects a deeper truth about the Sumerian worldview. The individual does not exist in isolation. The person is part of a web of relationships, part of a family line that extends backward to the ancestors and forward to the descendants. To die without children is not just a personal tragedy. It is a severing of that line, a breaking of the chain that connects the living and the dead. And that breaking has consequences that last beyond death. The Sumerians sang laments for the dead, long formal poems that described the journey to the underworld, that called out to the deceased, that expressed grief in carefully structured verses. These laments were not private. They were public performances sung by professional mourners, accompanied by instruments, witnessed by the community. They served multiple functions. They gave shape to grief, turned overwhelming emotion into structured art. They provided a kind of map for the dead, describing the path they would take, the gates they would pass through, the realm they would enter. And they reassured the living that the proper rituals were being performed, that the deceased was being sent off correctly, that the boundary between life and death was being respected. One such lament describes the journey in careful detail. The deceased must cross the river, must approach the gates, must answer the questions of the gatekeeper, must enter the dim halls where the other shades wait. The lament calls out to the deceased by name. It describes their virtues, their accomplishments, the grief of those left behind. It promises that offerings will be made, that the name will not be forgotten. It is both a farewell and a promise, both an ending and a continuation. You don't need to follow every word. Let the rhythm carry you. Let the ancient grief wash over you like water. The underworld also appeared in dreams, and dreams were taken very seriously. Sleep was understood as a kind of small death, a temporary loosening of the connection between body and soul. The soul, the animating force, might wander during sleep. It might travel to the edges of the underworld. It might encounter the dead. And so dreams in which the deceased appeared were not dismissed as mere imagination. They were communications, messages from the realm below. If a dead father appeared in a dream asking for water, the dreamer would wake and immediately go to the grave to pour a libation. The dream was understood as a literal request, the ghost reaching across the boundary to remind the living of their duty. If a dead child appeared, silent and watching, the parent would make offerings, would speak the child's name, would ensure that the spirit was not wandering restless and forgotten. Dreams were a threshold, a place where the two realms touched, and what happened in that threshold had to be honored in waking life. There were also dreams that warned of death, dreams of descending into darkness, dreams of being naked and powerless, dreams of gates opening and closing. These were omen dreams, signs that the dreamer or someone close to them might soon make the journey to Kur. Such dreams required rituals of protection, offerings to the gods, prayers to avert the fate that the dream foretold. The boundary between sleep and death was thin, and one had to be careful not to slip from one to the other unintentionally. The food of the dead is mentioned again and again in the texts. Clay, dust, bitter water. This is not symbolic. This is what the myths say the dead consume in the underworld. They eat clay because there is no other food. They drink bitter water because there is no other drink. The offerings poured by the living, the bread and beer and oil, seep down through the earth and provide a moment of relief, a taste of something other than dust. But that relief is temporary. The dead return to their clay, to their endless dim existence, to the house that is called the house of dust, where dust is the food and darkness is the garment. Some texts describe the underworld as having different regions or levels, though the details are never entirely clear. There are the outer regions, near the gates, where the newly dead arrive. There are the inner halls, where the long dead sit in silence. There is the deepest place, where Ereshkigal's throne room sits, where the Inanna judge, where the laws are kept and enforced. There may be rivers or streams within the underworld dark waters that flow through the realm. There may be fields of some kind, though nothing grows there. The geography shifts depending on which text you read, which myth you follow, but the essential nature remains consistent. It is a place of diminishment, of shadow, of stillness, and Ereshkigal remains on her throne, unchanging, eternal. She does not age. She does not tire of her role. She simply is, the way the underworld simply is. In some myths, she is described as beautiful, though it is a terrible beauty, the beauty of inevitability, of the grave, of the final silence. In others, she is simply the queen, and her appearance does not matter because no one who sees her returns to describe her. She is alone in a way that even the other gods are not alone. The gods above have temples, worshippers, festivals, hymns sung in their honor. Ereshkigal has none of these things. She is necessary, but she is not celebrated. She is feared and respected, but she is not loved. When Nergal descended to the underworld, the myths say it began with an insult. The gods were feasting, and Ereshkigal, unable to leave her realm, sent a messenger to collect her portion. Nergal, in arrogance or ignorance, failed to show the messenger proper respect. Ereshkigal demanded that Nergal be punished, that he come to the underworld to face her judgment. And so Nergal descended, bringing with him weapons and magic, prepared to fight his way out if necessary. He passed through the 7 gates. He entered Ereshkigal's throne room. And there, instead of immediate punishment, something unexpected happened. Desire, conflict, a struggle for dominance that may have been literal combat or may have been something else entirely. The myths are not explicit, but the result was that Nergal claimed a place beside Ereshkigal's throne. He became her consort, her equal in some tellings, her subordinate in others. And Ereshkigal, who had been alone since the beginning of time, had companionship of a sort. Though whether this brought her comfort or simply added another dimension to her isolation is unclear. Nergal is associated with plague, with war, with the destructive heat of summer that kills crops and brings disease. He is not a gentle god. His presence in the underworld makes a kind of sense. Death and destruction, the grave and the battlefield are closely related. But he is also a god who moves between realms. Unlike Ereshkigal, who is permanently bound to the underworld, Nergal can ascend to the world above. He can leave. And perhaps this makes Ereshkigal's isolation even more profound. Even her consort is not truly trapped with her. Even he has the freedom she does not. Let the images fade now. Let the throne room dissolve into shadow. You don't need to see it clearly. There are other myths, smaller stories, fragments preserved on broken tablets. A myth about a tree, the Hulapu tree, that grew by the Euphrates. Inanna tended it, intending to make a throne and a bed from its wood. But creatures took up residence in it. A serpent at the roots, the Anzu bird in the branches, and in the trunk, Lilith, a demon or spirit of the wilderness. The myth connects to the underworld through the serpent at the roots, a creature associated with Kur, with the depths, with the boundary between upper and lower worlds. Gilgamesh helped Inanna drive the creatures away, and from the wood of the tree, objects were made. A paku and a miku, a drum and a drumstick perhaps, or some other ritual objects. But these objects fell into the underworld, down through a hole in the earth, and could not be retrieved. The myth is fragmentary, and its meaning is debated, but it speaks to the constant presence of the underworld beneath the world of the living. The way things can fall into it. The way it is always there, waiting below. Another fragment describes Enlil's creation of the pickaxe, the tool that breaks the earth. And when the pickaxe breaks the earth for the first time, people emerge from the hole. Humanity rising from the ground, from the realm below. The connection between earth and underworld, between the clay of the ground and the clay of human bodies, is fundamental. We are made from the same substance as the grave. We return to what we were made from. The cycle is complete. There is also the story of Gilgamesh and Enkidu, though this extends beyond the purely Sumerian tradition into the later Akkadian and Babylonian tellings. After Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh is consumed with grief and fear. His beloved friend has descended to the underworld, and Gilgamesh, for the first time, truly understands that he too will die. He goes on a quest for immortality, seeking the secret of eternal life. He travels to the ends of the earth. He crosses the waters of death. He finds Utnapishtim, the flood survivor who was granted immortality by the gods. But Utnapishtim tells him the truth. Immortality was a unique gift, given once, never to be repeated. There is no escape from death. No way to avoid the descent to Kur. Gilgamesh is given a plant, a flower of youth that grows at the bottom of the sea. He retrieves it, believing it will restore his youth and stave off death. But on the journey home, a serpent steals the plant while Gilgamesh bathes in a pool. The serpent eats it and sheds its skin renewed. And Gilgamesh returns to Uruk empty-handed, having learned that death cannot be cheated, that the underworld waits for everyone, that even the greatest hero must eventually descend. But before all this, there is a moment where Gilgamesh is granted a vision of Enkidu. The ghost of Enkidu is allowed to rise from the underworld just for a moment to speak with his friend. And Gilgamesh asks him, "Tell me about the underworld. Tell me what it is like." Enkidu describes it. The house of dust, the house of darkness, the place where the dead sit in silence and eat clay. He describes how those with many sons are honored and those with none are abandoned. He describes the different fates of those who died in different ways. And then the vision ends. Enkidu sinks back into the earth. The boundary closes, and Gilgamesh is left with the knowledge that this is what awaits him. This is the fate of all mortals, no matter how great, no matter how beloved. The vision is not meant to comfort. It is meant to teach acceptance, to show that the underworld is real, is inevitable, and must be faced with understanding rather than denied with false hope. You can let go of the names now. Let them slip away like water through your fingers. The demons of the underworld, the Gala, appear in several myths. They are not demons in the sense of evil beings who torture souls. They are enforcers of the law, servants of Ereshkigal. They do not act from malice, but from necessity. When they seize Dumuzi, they are not punishing him for his failure to mourn. They are simply ensuring that the law is kept, that a substitute is provided, that the balance is maintained. They cannot be bribed. They cannot be fought. They can only be satisfied by the fulfillment of their purpose. In some texts, the Galar are described as creatures without mouths, or without the ability to eat or drink or enjoy the pleasures of life. They exist only to serve the underworld. They have no other function, no other desire. They are the law made flesh, if flesh is the right word for what they are made of. They rise from the depths when needed and return when their task is complete. They are neither good nor evil. They simply are. The Sumerians did not have a concept of Satan, of a being who opposed the gods and tempted humans to sin. They did not imagine the underworld as a place ruled by an adversary of heaven. Ereshkigal is not in rebellion against the gods above. She is part of the cosmic order, as necessary as the sun or the rain. The underworld is not a corruption of the divine plan. It is part of the plan. Death is not a punishment for the sin of the first humans. It is simply the natural end of life, built into the structure of existence from the beginning. This is a fundamentally different vision of death from what would develop later in other cultures. There is no promise of resurrection, no hope of heaven for the righteous, no threat of hell for the wicked. There is only Kur, the house of dust, the land of no return. And the only thing that makes existence there more bearable is the memory and care of the living. This shapes the Sumerian understanding of how to live well. You live well not to earn a reward in the afterlife, but because life is precious and brief. You have children not just for joy, but to ensure that someone will remember you when you are gone. You honor your ancestors not out of fear, but out of love and obligation. You make offerings to the dead not to appease angry spirits, but to maintain the connection, to keep the chain unbroken, to ensure that you too will be remembered when your time comes. The underworld is always beneath you, always waiting. Every grave you pass is an entrance to it. Every hole in the ground leads, eventually, to its depths. The earth is thin in places. The boundary is fragile. And so you must be careful. You must perform the rituals correctly. You must honor the dead properly. You must remember. And in remembering, you keep the dead alive in a way. Not truly alive, not breathing and walking in the world above, but alive in memory, present in the offerings poured into the earth, spoken of in prayers, called upon in dreams. The dead are gone, yes, descended to the house of dust, but they are not entirely absent, not as long as someone speaks their name. Let your breathing slow. Let the words become a rhythm, a gentle pulse in the darkness. The ancient city of had royal tombs, excavated thousands of years later by archaeologists who found astonishing things. Elaborate burials with hundreds of objects. Golden vessels. Lyres decorated with bulls' heads. Game boards made of precious materials, and evidence of human sacrifice. Servants and attendants buried with the king or queen, apparently willingly, perhaps drugged, perhaps believing they would continue to serve their ruler in the underworld. The archaeology shows us that the Sumerians took the afterlife seriously. They prepared for it. They equipped the dead for the journey. But even kings, with all their gold and all their servants, descended to the same underworld as everyone else. They might have more offerings, more memory, more honor. But they still went to the house of dust. They still ate clay. They still sat in the dim halls in silence. Death was the great equalizer. In the underworld, a king and a farmer were both just shades. Both Giddim. Both powerless before Ereshkigal's throne. There is something almost comforting in this, in a strange way. The underworld is not fair, but it is honest. It does not pretend that life continues unchanged after death. It does not promise impossible reunions or eternal happiness. It says this is what comes. This is the end of motion. This is the stillness. And because this is what comes, what matters is not what you will have in death, but what you do in life. How you are remembered. How you honor those who came before. How you prepare for those who will come after. The measuring of time in the underworld is unclear. Does time pass there as it does in the world above? Do the dead experience duration, or do they exist in an eternal present? The myths do not answer this directly. But the sense is that time becomes meaningless in Kur. There is no day or night, no seasons, no cycles. There is only the endless dim present, the sitting in silence, the waiting for nothing. When offerings are made, do the dead taste them? Do they truly drink the water poured into the earth? Or is it symbolic, a gesture that matters more for its intention than its literal effect? Again, the myths are not explicit. But the Sumerians acted as if the dead could indeed receive the offerings, could indeed benefit from them. And perhaps that belief was enough. Perhaps the act of pouring the water, of speaking the name, of remembering, was what mattered. The living doing what the living must do to maintain the bond with those who have gone before. The gates of the underworld stand in the myths as powerful symbols. 7 gates, 7 thresholds, 7 stages of transformation. Each gate strips away something. Each gate demands surrender. By the time you reach the innermost chamber, you have nothing left of what you were in the world above. You are reduced to your essence, whatever that essence is. Naked, powerless, equal to every other shade. This is not destruction. It is transformation. The myths do not say that Inanna ceased to be Inanna when she was stripped and killed. She was still herself, even in death. But she was herself without the external markers of power. Without the crown and the jewels and the robes. Just the core of who she was. And that core was enough for Enki to recognize, enough for the food and water of life to revive, enough for her to return. Perhaps this is what the gates teach. That identity is not in the external things, not in the symbols of power or the garments of status. Identity is something deeper, something that persists even when everything else is taken away. And when you descend to the underworld, that is what you take with you. That is what sits in the dim halls. The essential self, stripped of everything else. You don't need to think about this too hard. Just let it settle in the back of your mind, soft and quiet. Ereshkigal's pain, described in the myth of Inanna's descent, is worth returning to. She groans with the pain of her innards, of her heart, of her liver. This is physical pain, described in visceral terms. But what is the source of it? The myths do not say she is ill. They do not say she is being tortured. The pain seems to come from her existence itself, from the loneliness of her role, from the isolation of ruling a realm that no one chooses to visit, that everyone fears, that even the other gods avoid. She is necessary but unloved, essential but isolated. And when the Kurgara and the Galata mirror her pain, when they groan with her, instead of trying to fix her or judge her or turn away from her suffering, she responds with profound gratitude. She offers them a gift. She gives them what they ask for. This small act of empathy, of witnessing her pain without trying to minimize it, is enough to move her to generosity. There is a lesson in this, though the myths do not spell it out explicitly. Even the queen of the dead, even the embodiment of inevitable fate, even the most isolated and fearsome deity responds to compassion. The underworld is not beyond feeling. It is not a realm of absolute cold and cruelty. There is room for connection, for understanding, for small mercies. But the law remains. Even Ereshkigal's gratitude does not allow her to break the fundamental rules. Inanna can be revived, but a substitute must be found. The balance must be maintained. The boundary must be respected. Compassion exists within the law, not outside it. And so the stories continue to teach. They teach about boundaries and their importance. They teach about the price of transgression and the possibility of negotiation. They teach about memory and obligation. They teach about the proper way to die and the proper way to honor the dead. They teach about acceptance, about facing the inevitable with clear eyes rather than denial. The Sumerians did not fear death in the sense of running from it or pretending it did not exist. They acknowledged it. They built it into their worldview, into their daily practices, into their religious and social structures. They knew it was coming. They prepared for it. And they honored those who had already made the journey. The stars wheel overhead in the night sky. The seasons turn. The rivers flow from the mountains to the sea. And beneath it all, the underworld waits. Patient, inevitable, perfect in its own way. The gates stand ready. The gatekeeper watches. The queen sits on her throne in the depths, ruling the land of no return with stern and absolute authority. And the living go about their lives, knowing that one day they too will walk the road to those gates. Knowing that one day they too will be stripped of their power and their pride. Knowing that one day they too will sit in the dim halls and eat clay and wait in silence. But until that day comes, there is life. There is light. There is motion. There is the taste of bread and the sweetness of beer and the warmth of the sun on your face. There is love and work and family and memory. There is the pouring of water at the graves of ancestors. There is the speaking of names. There is the continuation of the line, the chain that connects past and future, living and dead. And when your time comes, when you walk that road, someone will remember you. Someone will pour water for you. Someone will speak your name into the air and into the earth. And you will sit in the house of dust, and you will know that you are not forgotten. The underworld is still there. The gates are still standing. Ereshkigal is still on her throne. The law is still the law, unchanged and unchanging since the first moment of creation. And the dead are still waiting in the dim halls, silent and patient, while above them the world continues to turn. Let it all fade now. Let the gates dissolve into shadow. Let the throne room sink back into the depths. Let the names and the stories become part of the quiet darkness. You have walked through the myths. You have glimpsed the land of no return. And now you can rest. You can let go. You can drift into sleep, knowing that the stories will still be there, that the underworld will still be waiting, that the cycle will continue long after you have forgotten these words. The dust settles. The silence deepens. And somewhere far below, in halls you will never see until your time comes, the dead are resting. And the queen watches over them. And the gates remain closed. And the law remains perfect. And you can sleep now, here in the world of breath and light, for as long as the night allows.